But I do want you to comment on, whether Bashar was his father's son, and in the sense of what were the biggest comparisons between the two, but also what were the biggest differences between the two men.
Well, the comparisons would be the regime, the nature of the regime. The differences were many, and Syrians remarked on this all the time. Um, protect, particularly as his regime began to collapse, as once the Arab Spring hit, 2011. Assad, the father, was a self-made man. He came from the village. He came up through the military. He survived a series of coups and came up. So he was a very cagey strategist. And he knew how to use repression, and force, which he did without blinking an eye, but he also knew how to keep his enemies close, if you will, in good mafia tradition. So what he did with the United States, for example, he never let the United States completely become alienated from his rule. He helped the United States in a number of situations, and the most famous of which was, of course, entering into Lebanon in 1976, the year after the
Yes.
Civil War began in 75. And then Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, they all turned to Syria and said, would you stop the civil war? And they let Syria's military go in with UN helmets on, really, to try to adjudicate the civil war. And that put Assad at the center of Lebanon and led to decades of Syrian rule in Lebanon. And he played a role. He went along with that because, of course, he didn't want to see the Sunnis of Lebanon win the civil war. He didn't want to see the Muslims win the civil war. He wanted to keep a balance between these different sectarian groups in the same way that he was doing in Syria. And that put him at the head of Lebanon, which was very valuable to him. He didn't want to see the PLO take over in Lebanon either and become much more powerful, because it would lead to potentially Israel invading Lebanon and being on 3 different borders with him. So then the next big, of course, one of the most famous is the Gulf War in 1990, when he sent an expeditionary force, a small 2,000 contingent, to join the coalition forces under America in driving Saddam out of Kuwait. So he was constantly working with the United States. He didn't alienate the United States. And same with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I was going to say he got quite close with the Gulf states as well.
He was close to the Gulf states, and he shared rule in Lebanon, in a sense, with the Saudi monarchy. He was always sensitive. And Saudis were promoted Hariri and everything, and he worked with Hariri. And he understood that Saudi Arabia had to have a role, and that would prolong Syria's predominance in Lebanon, as long as the Saudis would have a big say over the Sunni community and as well as the economy in Lebanon. And Saudis, of course, flocked to Lebanon, bought apartments, and that was their summer playground. Bashar didn't do that.
On that specific note, Bashar not doing that. I mean, so when Rafiq al-Hariri was assassinated in 2005, obviously Bashar was accused, and the Syrian government was accused of being behind that assassination. But was that in a way of him ruining the relationships with the Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia, that Hafez had fostered during his reign? Because then you see Bashar getting a lot closer to Iran.
Yes. And particularly in 2006, when there was the war with Lebanon, the war with Israel and Hezbollah, he called the Saudis half men. And he insulted the Saudi leadership because Hezbollah, in a sense, won the war. Saudi was hoping that Hezbollah would be destroyed by Israel. And Bashar really came out beating his chest, and he called them half men, something his father would never have done in 100 years. He insulted Saudi Arabia, and it's quite clear. Syria is a poor country. They need Saudi Arabia. Hafez al-Assad had kept that Saudi the Saudi-Syrian relationship always as a very important um, support for his regime. If not support, at least he kept the Saudis from working against him and turning against him. And Bashar didn't do that. And the Saudis turned against him, and they were going to be major funders in the war after 2011 and funded many militias and sent lots of money in to destroy him. And because he had insulted him straight up. So, all right. And the Hariri, of course, Syria is part of that triumvirate of Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. And many people criticize Bashar for getting too close to Nasrallah and Hezbollah and having them come to the country and stuff like that. And Assad never did that. He always kept them in a subordinate position at arm's length.
You mean
Now,
Hafez?
Hafez did, excuse me. Hafez al-Assad had kept Hezbollah. Of course, he worked closely with Hezbollah, but he didn't. He always made sure that they were seen as a subordinate, which is many reasons why I think the whole world turned to Syria when Hariri was assassinated. And it's not clear to me. I think we're going to find out a lot more very quickly now that Damascus has fallen. But, the initial UN investigation pointed the finger at Assad as the mastermind behind the murder of Hariri. But that whole investigation fell apart, and it seemed to be built on a lot of bad police work. Later, there was a new investigation that really pointed the finger at Hezbollah. And that raises the question of where did the decision for killing Hariri come from? Did it come from Iran? Did it come from Hezbollah? Did it come from Assad? And there are many reasons to think that Assad probably was, of course, he's complicit in it because his triumvirate is working together, but he may not have been the author of the decision. I don't know. We don't know how the decision was made, but we know that, the telephone records all pointed to these Hezbollah operatives, and certainly they were carrying it out. But it shows that the balance of power. If it turns out that Assad was not the author, it would fit into the character. You're trying to get this character sketch and how different he is from his father. And it's possible that he was a subordinate member of that triumvirate by that time. Not subordinate, but he wasn't in the driver's seat. And that Hezbollah and Iran were making these fateful decisions that were going to affect Syria without his leadership, which would explain why Syria loses Lebanon and Syria got off track on Lebanon. And Bashar was really a weakling in comparison to his father, who didn't understand the geopolitics of the region. He didn't understand how to keep Saudi Arabia and the United States from turning against him. And he alienated most of his allies. And we see this again with the recent fall of Damascus, because both Russia and Iran gave up on him. Mm-hmm. They turned away. They just thought he was a loser because he wouldn't make the adjustments. We saw how al-Jolani made incredible adjustments in the last 6 years as a ruler of Idlib. He got close to the Turks, and of course, al-Qaeda hated the Turks, or didn't hate the Turks, but they saw the Turks as being, they didn't want any outside control. And now he immediately made friends with Turkey. He's got this charm campaign with the West, in which he's gotten rid of the al-Qaeda elements that wanted international jihad. He's turned himself into a nationalist. He built up an administration and a state, and he's worked very closely with all the NGOs and other foreign elements. We will hopefully find out how closely he's worked and with which foreign governments, but he's clearly made lots of friends and changed his own face and the face of his government dramatically in order to build a coalition and to get buy-in from lots of different sectors of Syrian society, which he's done extraordinarily well and which has led to this being a fairly smooth, so far, transition. Bashar didn't do that. Bashar didn't make friends with the Gulf Arabs, even though they let him back in on the Arab League. They did it holding their nose. He didn't make the kind of concessions to them, like stopping Captagon or doing this or getting, making deals. He didn't do that with the Turks. Erdogan asked him to meet with him. And what did he do? He stiff-armed Erdogan. He didn't have a leg to stand on to do that. The Russians were appalled. They were exasperated. You've got to meet. Erdogan is going to make Erdogan could pull the plug on you. And Erdogan is now taking complete responsibility for overturning Assad. And Erdogan said just the other day, he should have met with me. You see, when you don't meet with me, bad things happen to you. And Bashar was a fool. He alienated every ally he had. And his father was much smarter and understood how to play a weak hand. And everybody always said about the father that he punched above his weight, like a boxer who could fight. Even though he was fairly skinny, you could fight somebody much bigger. And Bashar al-Assad did not punch above his weight. He punched. He lost all of that authority that Hafez and allies that Hafez had built up over the years.